welcome to this session of the Philosophy of Psychiatry webinar. It is our honor today to introduce you to Elyn Saks, who is a distinguished professor of law, professor of psychology and psychiatry and the behavioral sciences at the USC Gold School of Law, director of the Saks Institute for Mental Health Law, Policy and Ethics, adjunct professor of psychiatry at the UC San Diego School of Medicine, and faculty at the New Center for Psychoanalysis. She served as USC Gold's Associate Dean for Research from 2005 to 2010, and also teaches at the Keck School of Medicine. Professor Saks received her JD from Yale Law School and a PhD in psychoanalytic science from the New Center of Psychoanalysis. She was also awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Pepperdine University. Elyn Saks writes extensively in the area of law and mental health, having published 5 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters. Her research has included the ethical dimensions of psychiatric research and forced treatment of people with mental illness. Her memoir, The Center Cannot Hold: My Journey Through Madness, describes her struggles with schizophrenia and her managing to craft a good life for herself in the face of a dire prognosis. She's also the author of Informed Consent to Psychoanalysis, The Law, the Theory, and the Data, published in Fordham University Press in 2013, Refusing Care, Forced Treatment, and the Right of Mentally Ill in University of Chicago Press in 2002, Interpretation, The Limits of Hermeneutic Psychoanalysis, published at Yale University Press in 1999, and Jekyll on Trial, Multiple Personality Disorder and Criminal Law, published in New York University Press in 1997. She has won numerous honors, including a 2009 John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Grant. In fall 2010, she created the Saks Institute for Mental Health Law, Policy and Ethics at UST, a think tank that studies issues at the intersection of law, mental health, and ethics. The Institute is a collaborative effort that has included faculty and graduate students from several UST departments like law, psychiatry, psychology, social work, philosophy, neuroscience, gerontology, and engineering. Today, we're very happy to hear her talking, and her talk is entitled Schizophrenia and I, Making Peace with My Mental Illness. Elyn Saks, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really kind introduction. I very much appreciate it. So my title of my talk today is Schizophrenia and I, Making Peace with My Mental Illness, as you said. And let me start by thanking you, Sarah Arnaud, and Anne-Marie Gagne, Julianne, for the kind invitation to speak to you today. I'm especially pleased to present to the program in the philosophy of psychiatry. I myself studied philosophy at Oxford, and although I left philosophy behind when I returned to the US, I felt that the questions are hugely important, and I have always felt a deep kinship with the field. Speaking to you today feels a bit like a homecoming for me, and I thank you for that. So I've lived with schizophrenia for the last 45 years. I've spent hundreds of days in psychiatric hospitals. I was given a, quote, grave prognosis and was told that I would live in a board and care were I well enough to stay out of a hospital. Had I been born even 20 years earlier, that's almost certainly where I would be today. But things have turned out differently for me. Good psychiatric treatment has kept me alive. Sensitive and wise psychiatric treatment has allowed me to flourish. People who struggle with mental health disorders are not just walking symptoms that can be cured by a pill. Mental health and mental illness involve whole people who live in relational, social, and political contexts. We must understand people in the richness and fullness of their lives. The title of my talk today, again, is Schizophrenia and I, Making Peace with My Mental Illness. My title is an attempt to convey that schizophrenia is a relational illness. By relational, I mean that it involves personal identity, that it profoundly implicates one's social world, and that it has political meanings as well. That's what I want to address today: the identity, the social, and the political aspects of schizophrenia. So again, my title, Making Peace with My Schizophrenia, is intended to convey that I have a relationship with my illness, that the nature of this relationship affects my social world, and that how I conceptualize the role of this illness and how I respond according to this conceptualization is, among other things, a political issue. In my brief remarks today, I want to address these three aspects of mental illness, and I'll be doing that using excerpts from my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold: My Journey Through Madness, as a window into these issues. I have left time at the end for discussion. I am eager to hear your thoughts on my reflections. In our discussion, I would be especially eager to hear your thoughts on the philosophy of mental illness. As my remarks will make clear, my approach to my mental illness throughout my life has largely left the philosophical questions to the side, and I simply haven't done the heavy lifting regarding the nature of mental illness. I've not done so not because I don't think it's important, that the questions are important. They certainly are. Rather, I have not done so because I've simply not had the energy. Getting tenure, keeping up with academic responsibilities, and making peace with my mental illness have been a lifelong endeavor. Now, at this stage in my life and career, perhaps I will take the opportunity of speaking with you as an opportunity to reflect on these hugely important philosophical questions. So I will start where I believe my illness began. The seeds of my illness appeared when I was in high school. It was an isolated incident that came apparently out of nowhere and quickly passed. In retrospect, it was my illness announcing itself to me. So I will now read from the text of my memoir. It was around this time that I read Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. For days afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the book and what she went through. For some reasons, it made me restless, distracted. One morning in class, with Plath on my mind, I suddenly decided that I needed to get up, leave school, and walk home. Home was 3 or 4 miles away. As I walked along, I began to notice that the colors and shapes of everything around me were becoming very intense. And at some point, I began to realize the houses I was passing were sending messages to me. They said, "Look closely, you are special. You are especially bad. Look closely and ye shall find. There are many things you must see, see, see." I didn't hear these words as literal sounds, as though the houses were talking and I were hearing them. Instead, the words just came into my head. They were ideas I was having, yet I instinctively knew they were not my ideas. They belonged to the houses and the houses that put them in my head. By the time I walked through my parents' front door, 1, maybe 2 hours later, I was tired, hot, and very frightened. I forgot to turn my phone off. Let me just turn my phone off here. Okay, there we go. Ending the passage. I then became seriously ill as a Marshall Scholar studying ancient philosophy at Oxford University. At first, it seemed I had depression with mild psychotic features, which, as you know, is often how schizophrenia begins. But then my illness evolved into a pure thought disorder. Despite much resistance, I eventually found my way to a psychiatric hospital with strong encouragement from my doctors at the university, whom I had seen at the urging of a friend who himself is a neurologist. I had graduated as class valedictorian at Vanderbilt University and been accepted as a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, but I was in terrible shape. I spent much of my time wandering the streets of Oxford, gesticulating incoherently, mumbling to myself, and contemplating various ways to commit suicide, to rid the world of my evil. I had absolutely no insight into the severity of my illness. I had no awareness that there might be a gap between how I saw myself and how others saw me. I entered the hospital voluntarily. After about a week or two there, everything changed. It wasn't something that a doctor or a fellow patient or a friend said. It was a simple look into a mirror. I saw myself. Again, reading from the text. It was the first time I'd actually seen myself in weeks, and it felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Good God, I thought, who is that? I was emaciated and hunched over like someone 3 or even 4 times my age. My face was gaunt, my eyes were simultaneously vacant and full of terror. My hair was wild and filthy, my clothes wrinkled and stained. It was the visage of a crazy person on the long-forgotten back ward of a hospital for lunatics, ending the passage. The gap between who I imagined myself to be and whom I saw in the mirror that day was profound and unavoidable. Far from making friends with my mental illness, until that moment, I did not truly understand that I had a mental illness to make friends with. That moment, that look into the mirror, was the beginning of a journey that would last over 4 decades. In retrospect, it was no accident that the song I chose to listen to most often on the psych ward after that experience was the Beatles. Once there was a way to get back homeward. Once there was a way to get back home. I felt as though I were in a foreign land and I needed to find my way home. Now, I think Freud was a brilliant thinker and he got many things right. What I don't think Freud got right is his view that intense talk therapy is not helpful for people who are psychotic. According to Freud, analysis was not appropriate for psychotic patients because an individual who was actively psychotic could not form a transference to the analyst. Freud's view is absolutely not consistent with my experience. In my experience, the need to be in a relationship, to be part of a social world, may be most profound precisely when someone is psychotic. Let me say this point again. When a person is psychotic is when the person may be feeling most scared and alone. That is when a relationship can be most important. I began my first work with a psychoanalyst at Oxford, and it was difficult, painful work. But I noticed from my first experience with intensive talk therapy is 2 things. First, my analyst was hugely helpful in diffusing a sense of shame that went along with the thoughts I was having. My thoughts were violent and deeply disturbing about myself and other people. My analyst, Mrs. Jones, was able to tolerate everything. It's difficult for me adequately to convey how helpful it was to me to have a therapist who could listen, not judge me, and not threaten to put me in the hospital or call the police. In short, I felt safe with her. Second, I noticed that as I felt more related to my analyst, Mrs. Jones, I began to make friends and it began to be easier to work again. As I became able to share my internal experience, my ability to interact with the world around me got better. I want to note and emphasize that the most helpful consultant I had in England said 2 things. First, I needed to be in an intensive psychotherapy. And second, I should be back in school as a way to exercise my mind. I will be forever grateful to that consultant who stood alone amidst others who were recommending that I leave school and return home to the States. I like to say that my mind has been my best friend and my worst enemy. That consultant understood that nurturing my mind offered me a path forward in my life. I finished my degree at Oxford and I came back to the States to study law at Yale. My transition was rocky. For someone not familiar with a psychotic illness, it's difficult to understand that at this point, I still didn't really believe I had a mental illness. My thought was that I was somehow different than other people, not in a good way, but that through the exercise of willpower, I could tame whatever was wrong. Quite literally, like one has a wild horse and a corral that you must tame. The challenge, as I framed it at that point in my life, was to take that woman who I had seen in the mirror at Oxford and tame her and groom her, or maybe just make sure she always stayed at home when I went out. I was not mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. So I began Yale Law School. I was not in treatment, nor was I on medication. As a side note, my Oxford analyst, Mrs. Jones, had never suggested that I consider medication. Within several weeks after law school began, I became overwhelmed. One night in the library of the Yale Law School, I became quite psychotic, and the following day, I ended up being taken to the hospital by one of my professors, whose assignment had set me over the edge. At the hospital, I found myself in a small private room waiting for a doctor. The attendant was kind, and I readily gave him a telephone wire belt, which I had proudly made the evening before when I'd been floridly psychotic on the roof of the Yale Law School and, not satisfied with my jeans and bland t-shirts, decided to accessorize. I had also picked up a nail that I had found, and I kept the nail in my pocket. Many people who are psychotic carry things which can be used as weapons, not because they want to hurt someone, but because they're afraid that someone might want to hurt them. This visit to the emergency room resulted in a lengthy 5-month hospitalization. Now I'll read from the text. But you can't have my 6-inch nail, I said, patting my pocket. Then someone whom I'll call the doctor arrived. Give that to me, he ordered. No, I said. The doctor immediately called for security. Another attendant came in, this one not so nice. Once he pried the nail from my fingers, I knew I was done for. Within seconds, the doctor and his whole team of goons swooped down, grabbed me, lifted me out of the chair, and slammed me down on a nearby bed with such force that I saw stars. Then they bound both my legs and arms to the metal bed with thick leather straps, and they actually put a net across my body up to my neck. A sound came out of my mouth that I never heard before. Half groan, half scream, barely human, and pure terror. Then the sound came again, forced from somewhere deep inside my belly and scraping my throat raw. No, I shouted, stop this, don't do this to me. I glanced up to see a face watching the entire scene through the window in the street door. Steel door, sorry. Why was she watching me? Who was she? I was an exhibit, a specimen, a bug impaled on a pin, and helpless to escape. Please, I begged, please, don't do this. This is like something from the Middle Ages. Please, please, don't do this to me. Ending the passage. Shame is a pervasive experience of people with psychosis. Often we're ashamed of what we're thinking, and so we hide our thoughts from other people. This shame may play itself out in many ways. After my experience in the emergency room, 5 months of hospitalization ensued. Hospitalization involving long-term restraints and seclusion. So I was in restraints 20 hours a day for the first 2 days, and then 5 to 15 hours a day for the next 2 weeks. My hospital chart had this notation: use restraints liberally. I was also forcibly medicated and given no privacy. In the beginning, I was even watched as I showered or went to the bathroom, and was not allowed privacy while talking to people, including my parents. I believe that the hands-off approach, perhaps it could even be described as benign neglect, that I experienced at the Oxford Hospital was much preferable to the over-interventionist approach, often driven by risk management concerns of the American hospitals. I do believe that force may have an appropriate limited role in psychiatric treatment. But force should never be confused with treatment. Reflecting on my experience in American psychiatric hospitals, I do not believe that the use of force helped me move forward toward healing, toward accepting that I had a mental illness, or toward agreeing to take medication. In fact, I think the use of force had precisely the opposite effect. As I have come to say, I am very pro-psychiatry, but very anti-force. After 2 weeks at an emergency commitment, I was faced with the question of whether I would try to get out of the hospital. Parenthetically, the doctors put me on the emergency commitment because they said I was, quote, dangerous to myself and others, unquote, and because they said I was, quote, gravely disabled, unquote. The reason they gave for me being gravely disabled was that I couldn't do my Yale Law School homework. I wondered what that meant about much of the rest of New Haven. I could contest their motion to civilly commit me. To me, the choice seemed clear. I would demand a hearing to fight the commitment. I brought this up to my father, who is also an attorney. My father was equally clear. Do not contest this, because if you lose, you now have been civilly committed and you're going to have to report your commitment every time you apply for a license to practice law. He said to me, you certainly don't want anything in your record where a judge orders you to stay in the hospital. When I speak about the political dimensions of schizophrenia, I speak not only about the social stigma, which is real and pervasive. I also speak about these life events that can follow an individual with schizophrenia for decades. There are profound political aspects of this illness that can become huge burdens that people with schizophrenia carry, and it's important that you, who work with people with schizophrenia, are aware of them. I should say parenthetically here that I don't know how commitment laws work in Quebec, so perhaps the equation would be different than in the United States. The stigma of mental illness can follow a person for a lifetime. And I have found that stigma can be pervasive. When I returned to the law school, I decided to write an article for the Law Journal on the use of mechanical restraints in psychiatric hospitals. I approached a law professor faculty member who was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst as well, and explained my project to him without giving any of my personal history. I said that I believed mechanical restraints would be painful and degrading. His response to me was, you don't understand, Ellen. These people are psychotic. They aren't like you and me. They wouldn't experience restraints in the way we would. I didn't have the courage in that moment to tell him these people are just like you and me, and that's exactly how they would experience restraints. It was only by othering me and people with lived experience in mental illness that he could accept for us what he would never accept for himself or his loved ones. I'll share another brief anecdote about stigma. I went to the ER with a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a brain bleed. I was confused and incoherent. At that time, about 50% of people with subarachnoid hemorrhages died from it. I'm glad I didn't know the statistic at that point, or I might have had a heart attack. The ER folks learned about my psychiatric history, and then a predictable disaster occurred. They believed I was simply having an episode, a psychotic episode. They sent me home. I went back the next day at the frantic urging of friends who this time accompanied me to the ER. They were able to convince the doctors that something was very different. The ER ran simple tests and they admitted me to the hospital. They did spinal taps and angiograms and other procedures. I was very lucky to have had those friends with me. Otherwise, I imagine I would once again have been told to take more of my medication and sent home. We discussed personal identity aspects of the illness. We've talked some about the social aspects of the illness, and we've touched upon the political aspects. I want to push these ideas further by talking about the centrality of relationships to healing. Healing does not occur in isolation. It's painful to me when I speak with mental health professionals working in community mental health centers who measure their caseloads in the hundreds. A close friend of mine, a conscientious and kind psychiatrist working in a clinic in Los Angeles, arguably the best clinic that we have in LA. It was on the West Side, had around 350 patients. How in the world do you do that? Healing begins in relationship, and in all kinds of ways, a patient's relationship with a mental health professional is an integral part of the healing. I worry tremendously that this point has been lost on our policymakers. Of course, other relationships are healing as well. After I was hospitalized upon returning to the States, the US, I took the rest of that year off, what would have been my first year at law school, and then returned the following fall to begin again. It was when I began again at Yale Law School, the second time, that I made my closest friend and a man named Steve Benke. Steve is an attorney and a clinical psychologist with an MDiv degree, and he has an appointment in clinical ethics at Harvard's Department of Psychiatry. Steve is with us here today. Thank you, Steve. Again, reading from the text. One of the worst aspects of schizophrenia is the profound isolation, the constant awareness that you're different, some sort of alien, not really human. Other people have flesh and bones and insides made of organs and healthy living tissue. You are only a machine with insides made of metal. Medication and talk therapy allay this terrible feeling, but friendship can be as powerful as either. Steve Benke and I were in contract class together, and a couple of times he had asked me for an assignment. Other than that, we had never really spoken. One evening at dinner in the law school dining hall, the conversation was casual and pleasant, drifting from one subject to another, classes and law journal and summer jobs. I noticed that Steve seemed engaged enough. He nodded, he smiled. And after a while, it began to look like simple politeness. As our classmates got up to leave the table, I realized I wasn't ready to go just yet. And there began one of those conversations that last for a lifetime, one in which there's immediate comfort and acceptance, the equivalence of someone's strong hand offered to you when you most need to grasp it. That first talk flew far and wide. How we got to Yale, who our families were, then philosophy and religion, and what mattered to us and why. Steve had majored in classics at Princeton, where he was named salutatorian of his class and spoke in Latin at graduation. The summer after graduation, he worked as a janitor at a small town in the airport, and then he'd gone to Rome, where he lived with a group of Benedictine monks and read Latin at the Vatican with a monk who served as a Pope's Latinist. He considered entering the monastery and studying medieval philosophy, but decided against it because medieval philosophy had ceased to hold his interest, at least as a lifelong endeavor. Instead of becoming a monk, Steve came to Yale Law School, and so did I, and neither one of us was quite sure why. Sometime later, it occurred to me that at the very moment I was being tied to a bed in the psychiatric ward, screaming bloody murder and afraid for my life, Steve was singing Gregorian chant in a monastery overlooking the ancient city of Rome. And here we were now, come to the same place from two very different directions. It was past midnight when we said goodnight, and as I walked back to my room, I had a distinct feeling in the middle of my usual muddle that I'd been unexpectedly blessed. I don't know why I decided to tell Steve the truth about my illness, about myself. I don't know why I thought I could trust him, but I did. I believed from our very first conversation that this man would be a significant friend and a force, thank you, for good in my life. Once the possibility came to my mind, I realized how much I wanted it to be so. But I didn't believe that could happen unless I revealed the truth about myself and let him see me in full. So much of what I did on a daily basis was about faking it. I knew that I would never fake it with him. And so, on a rainy afternoon at a pizzeria in New Haven, I shared my history. Aside from doctors and therapists, it was the first time I'd ever done this with anyone, anywhere. Ending the passage. Without Steve's support, I could not have made it so successfully through law school, if indeed I could have made it at all. Steve was a second set of eyes who could see me slipping when I couldn't. He was a rock who could support me when I was about to fall, and he was a true friend. who helped me find meaning and pleasure in my life when meaning and pleasure felt like distant memories. After Steve had graduated from law school and left New Haven, my then analyst, who I'll call Dr. White, announced that he was going to close his practice in 3 months, fully 2 years before I had planned to leave. The news of White's leaving shattered me. Again, I returned to what I see as Freud's mistaken view that psychotic patients don't form transferences with their analysts. In fact, my transferences were quite powerful, and the end of my first 2 analytic relationships could easily have landed me in the hospital. And in fact, I think one of them was a contributing factor to my hospitalization in New Haven. When White gave me the news of his planned early retirement, Steve was traveling around the country, interviewing for PhD programs in clinical psychology. He had sensed that something was terribly wrong, and he came to New Haven to see me. Reading from the text. I opened the door of my studio apartment. Steve would later tell me that for all the times he'd seen me psychotic, what he saw that day shocked him. For a week or more, I had barely eaten. I was gaunt and moved as though my legs were wooden. My face looked and felt like a mess. Since I pulled down all the shades, the apartment in the middle of the afternoon was in near total darkness. The air was fetid, the place was a shambles. Steve has worked with many patients who suffer from severe mental illness, and to this day, he'll tell me that on that afternoon, I looked as bad as any he'd ever seen. Hi, I said, then returned to the couch where I was silent for several minutes. Thank you for coming, Steve, I finally said. Crumbling world, word, voice, tell the voices to stop. Time has come. White is leaving, Steve said somberly. I'm being pushed into a grave. The situation is grave, I wrote. Gravity is pulling me down. Tell them to get away. I'm scared. It's an example of loose associations. Ending the passage. Healing takes place in many forms and in many venues. I could not have survived this illness without close friends, family, and colleagues who have known me over the course of my illness and have been there to help me. Healing takes place in relationship. At this point, I want to mention a project of the Saks Institute that has supported decision-making. Our research focuses on supporting individuals with lived experience as they make treatment decisions. The goal of our research is to explore whom individuals choose to help them make these important decisions. We believe that supported decision-making will enhance an individual's ability to exercise their autonomy by including trusted friends in the decision-making process. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, please let me say as plainly as I can, our approaches and our policies must be based on the centrality of relationship to healing. Perhaps that sounds soft-headed, but relationships are what saved my life, and I believe relationships are where healing begins. As wonderful as Steve was and is, he was a friend, like a brother. Around the time that I had received tenure, or shortly thereafter, I ran into a man named Will, a man I thought was handsome, friendly, and smart, a man with whom I had tried to flirt a few times when I was working for tenure, and he was working in the law library at USC. It had been over a decade since I'd been on a date. I was just too tormented with internal demons to date. So my inner demons had left no room in my life for romance. I mustered my courage and asked if he'd like to have lunch sometime, reading from the text. When it came to my personal life after my illness had quieted down somewhat, I started nurturing a fragile but growing hope for a relationship with a man named Will, a librarian at the University of Southern California and an artist. I had tried flirting with him to no avail. Who knew how to do that? But after he left USC, he invited me to lunch. And then he invited me to see the California Poppy Reserve in Lancaster, not far from Los Angeles. I kept hinting how cold I was, hoping he would put his arm around me, but he didn't. But when he kissed me goodnight after our first date, I thought to myself, this is even better than getting an article accepted. Kind of sad. The next day, Will brought me a feather from his parrot, which he pasted on my computer. And that night, I asked my closest Vanderbilt friend, Kenny, whether he thought that a guy plucking a feather from his bird to paste on your computer meant he liked you. To which Kenny responded without a beat. I don't know, Ellen, but one thing for sure, he likes you better than he likes his bird. I wanted a relationship with Will, and slowly I began to believe that it actually might happen. Eventually, I told Will that I loved him, and indeed that he was the first man I'd ever loved in that way. He said that made him very sad. At the right moment, I told him about my illness, and he responded as gently and kindly as a person could. If Steve's friendship had made me feel human, Will was making me feel like a woman. Ending the passage. When I say my relationship with Steve made me feel human, please don't take that metaphorically. I did not feel like a human. I felt my insides were made of metal and that things that happened to other people, feelings other people had, weren't part of my life. I believed I was something else, a machine. Please understand how shaming this experience would be for someone to tell you, especially a young person who is just getting to know their mind. It was those two relationships with Steve and with Will which brought me not simply to think, but to feel that I'm human and capable of loving relationships. Today, Steve and Will are my closest friends, and I think of them as my two pillars. But there was a point where I thought I may have lost Steve. I suffer from an episode of Capgras syndrome, in which you believe that the person has been taken over by someone or something else. That person is no longer really that person, akin to the film The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, if any of you happen to see it. The Capgras episode happened to me in the mid-90s when I was in intense struggle with my analyst, who I'll call Dr. Kaplan, about how much medication I should be on. As was often with the case with my treatment, struggles about real-world, practical issues such as how many pills I would take had delusional counterpoints. The struggle over medication, which many psychiatric patients experience, and other struggles, with Dr. Kaplan left me with violent fantasies about what I wanted to do to him, and I experienced vivid fantasies about ways I could hurt him. These thoughts got talked about in the therapy. Talking about my violent thoughts helped diffuse them, but in this case, the struggle was intense enough that my delusional thinking can overwhelm. Dr. Kaplan and I reached a compromise about how much medication I would take, which I was not happy with, but which I agreed with. The Capgras symptoms dissipated, and they left me and Will and Steve shaken. The only way to understand why the Capgras episode was so disturbing to me is to understand that the relationship with Steve and Will were a tether to my own humanness. If I lost these ties to my humanness, I might really no longer be human. Again, I'm not speaking in metaphor here. I really didn't believe I was human. Please let me emphasize that I'm not an autonomy purist. Indeed, I'm considered on the conservative side by certain individuals because I do believe that there are appropriate times for coerced interventions. My belief, based on my personal experience, is that coercion always comes with a price. In certain circumstances, we may be willing to pay the price of coercion, but we should never ignore the price we pay. I've been talking here about myself and relationship. I would like to return to say a few more words about my relationship with my mental illness and how I conceptualize that relationship. When I moved to Los Angeles from New Haven, my analyst and I developed a way of talking, a sort of heuristic about my illness and my relationship to my illness. There were, in our manner of speaking, three me's. There was Elyn, there was Professor Saks, and there was the lady of the medical charts. I want to be clear, we were not talking about these as different personalities, rather as different aspects of myself that I experienced differently. I could not integrate these three aspects of myself. How could I be a thinker of big thoughts, an academic, if my mind were so damaged? How could I be both Professor Saks and the lady of the medical charts? And where did Elyn fit in all this? What took a huge amount of effort and what was ultimately self-defeating was to keep them separate. I wasn't sure who was the real me. This confusion expressed itself in an intense ambivalence toward my medication. For many years, my motto was, the less medicine, the less defective. I believed that if I could get by without medication, that I didn't really have a mental illness. Steve was a virtual saint, as he spent literally years of our relationship going through this time and time again when I tried to get off my medication with disastrous results. It wasn't simply that I didn't like the side effects of my psychiatric medication. The need to take medication reached to the core of my identity. If I could get by without medication, I wasn't really mentally ill, and the lady at the charge would disappear. Only Ellen and the professor would be left as the real me. This cycle culminated in one final effort to get off my medication several years after I'd been on the faculty at USC, reading from the text. While White had supported me many times in my efforts to get off medication, which I undertook with great gusto and failed miserably at each time, one battle between Kaplan and me concerned the use of medication. Early on, we really locked horns over this. Kaplan thought I should just stay on the meds and get on with my life. For me, as I said, the motto of the less medicine, the less effective held sway. Part of the way that I could prove that I didn't have a mental illness, which I resisted mightily for many years, was to get off medication. And so I kept trying and trying and trying. I decided I would make one last effort to get off. I thought I'd never really tried hard enough. I put lots of extra supports in place to help me keep myself true to my goals. And so I started the reduction. I hid what I was feeling when I started feeling bad. The days and nights were harder now. The sheer physical effort of containing my body and my thoughts felt like trying to hold back a team of wild horses. Sleep was spotty and filled with dreams that left me awake and sweating in terror. Nevertheless, I dropped down again. Months before, I'd accepted an invitation to present at a workshop at Oxford. By the time I boarded the plane for home, I was a complete wreck. When I walked into Kaplan's office my first day back, I headed straight for the corner, crouched down on the floor, and began to shake. All around me were thoughts of evil beings, poised with daggers. They'd slice me up in thin slices or make me swallow hot coals. Kaplan would later describe me as, quote, writhing in agony. Even in this state, what he accurately described as acutely and floridly psychotic, I refused to take more meds. The mission is not yet complete. Immediately after the appointment with Dr. Kaplan, I went to see Dr. Martyr, that is his real name, which he doesn't mind, a schizophrenia expert who was following me for a movement disorder caused by the meds called tardive dyskinesia, or TD. He'd never seen me ill before and had been under the impression, and I hadn't disabused him of it, that I had a mild psychotic illness and that my primary concern was avoiding or at least minimizing tardive dyskinesia. Once in his office, I sat down on his couch, folded over, and began muttering. I was disheveled. I couldn't remember when I'd slept or what I'd eaten. When had I bathed? In Oxford? Before Oxford? Did it matter if we were all going to die anyway? Anyone who walked into that room would have thought Martyr was treating a schizophrenic street person. Weeks later, people told me that's exactly what I looked like. Head explosions and people trying to kill. Is it okay if I totally trash your office? You need to leave if you think you're going to do that, said Martyr. Okay, small, fire on ice. Tell them not to kill me. Tell them not to kill me. What have I done wrong? All the explosions. Hundreds of thousands with thoughts. Interdiction. Ellen, do you feel like you're dangerous to yourself or other people? He asked. That's a trick question, I said. I don't think you ask a mental health law professor whether she meets the criteria for commitment in the language of the statute. I'm really not sure how you do it, how you ask her, but not in that way. No, it's not, he said. I'm serious. I think you need to be in the hospital. I could get you into UCLA right now and the whole thing could be very discreet. Ha, ha, ha. You're offering to put me in the hospital? Hospitals are bad. They're mad. They're sad. One must stay away. I'm God, or I used to be. I give life and I take it away. Forgive me, for I know not what I do. I really think a hospital would be a good idea, Martyr said. No, thank you, oh so very much, I said. All right then, but if I were you, I'd stay away from work for a while. You don't want your colleagues to see this. Thanks, banks, bang, bye. See you soon. Oblivious to the look on his face, I left. The next morning, I dragged myself to my office, my hideout, my refuge. I ran into my colleague, Ed, in the hall, and he quickly figured out what was going on. Ellen, what the hell is happening? I thought you were kidding at first, but you're not, are you? Does anyone else know about this? Is it okay for anyone else to know? I wouldn't mind telling Michael, I said, not the Archangel one, our colleague. Suffice to say that Ed eventually brought me home, showing the good judgment to follow my doctor's advice rather than tackle me to the ground and take me to the hospital, as others were recommending, including his internist wife. Eventually, I acceded to everyone's demand that I take more meds. I could not deny the truth, and I could not change it. The wall that kept me, Elyn, Professor Saks, separate from the insane woman I had seen in that mirror long ago, lay smashed in the rooms and in the passage. And then another event pushed me past the point of no return in accepting that I indeed had a mental illness. I got on a new drug. Because of the risk of my meds, Kaplan suggested one of the new classes of antipsychotics, a drug called olanzapine. I ended up, so at that time, the high dose was supposed to be 20, and I was on 60 or 70 with a lot of breakthrough symptoms. So I got on clozapine, which is a cumbersome drug, but really the catalog in terms of efficacy, and it helped me a lot. But with the olanzapine originally, the change was fast and dramatic. First, the side effects were much less than with thiazide. More important, the clinical result was, not to overstate it, like daylight dawning after a long night. I could see the world in a way I'd never seen it before. The illness was still there, but it wasn't pushing me around as much as it was. Finally, I could focus on the task at hand, unencumbered by the threat of lurking demons. The most profound effect of the new drug was to convince me once and for all that I actually had a real illness. For 20 years, I struggled with that acceptance, managing to hold on to the belief that basically there was nothing unusual about my thoughts. Everyone's mind contained the chaos that mine did. It's just that they were all much better at managing it than I was. My problem, I thought, had less to do with my mind than it had to do with my lack of social graces. I was not mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. Of course, that wasn't true, and there's no way to overstate what a thunderclap this revelation was to me. And with it, my final and my most profound resistance to the idea that I was mentally ill began to give way. Ironically, the more accepted I had a mental illness, the less the illness defined me. It became accident, as it were, and not essence, at which point the riptide that had kept sucking me in set me free. Ending the passage. I was finally able to integrate the, let me just check something. The three parts of myself. I was indeed Elyn, the professor, and the lady of the medical charts. I was making friends with the lady of the charts, my mental illness, that allowed Elyn and the professor to flourish and to enjoy the many wonderful relationships that have blessed my life. I've been enormously gratified how my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness, has been received. With monies from a MacArthur grant, I founded the Saks Institute for Mental Health Law and Policy at USC. The goal of the Saks Institute is to translate ideas into action to better the lives of people with mental illness. I'm very proud to say that folks with lived experience are involved in every aspect of what we do at the Institute. We are your sisters, your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your colleagues, and your friends. We want, in the words of Sigmund Freud, what everyone wants, to work and to love. As I reflect back on my life, I wish I had learned to work and to love earlier. I wish I wouldn't have had to endure all the struggles within, that I could have lived a life without mandates. I don't know what could have made me smarter sooner, or could have sped up the process. And so I leave with you that question and that request. Look for ways to help our youth make peace with their schizophrenia. Thanks for listening to me today. However we conceptualize mental illness, let us never lose sight of the humanity of those of us who walk this journey with mental illness as our companion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elyn Saks, for this wonderful talk.